That's why they used to get 67,000 people going to watch Manchester United, and I can't tell you about 60,000 of those went to see Denis Law.
United unsatisfied to lead 5-1. Denis Law backfields it to score his third goal.
Supreme accuracy to Pinelli. It's against Law. That's it.
Heard. Has to watch for Law. It's a goal by Law.
Ferret has good ball to Johnson. Law. Wall pass. Ferret. Smith. Got that. Law.
Denis Law is perhaps one of the most famous Scottish football players who ever lived. He is so gifted that footballing legend Pelé once remarked that he was the only British player who would have made it to the Brazilian national team. Law's ability to trap the ball, slink past defenders and smash goals on the turn of a volley made him the only Scottish player ever to win the coveted Ballon d'Or. However, it was heading the ball that Law believes made him the latest in a wave of high-profile footballers to have been diagnosed with dementia. On August 19th, 2021, Law announced that he was the sixth member of Manchester United's 1968 European Cup winning side to be diagnosed with dementia. Two of Law's United teammates, Nobby Stiles and Bobby Charlton, also make up the 5 players in England's 1966 World Cup team to also have been diagnosed. In fact, according to the World Health Organization, between 5 and 8% of the population over the age of 60 has some form of dementia. But 7 years after the former England striker Jeff Assel was declared the first footballer to have died from heading the ball, studies suggest that the rate of dementia among footballers could be much, much higher. Football, and the act of heading in particular, has been linked to damaging players' brains since 2014 when a coroner attributed Assel's death to industrial disease from repeated head impacts. Assel died in 2002, aged 59, and studies later found that his brain showed signs of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, a neurodegenerative disease caused by repeated head trauma and often observed in American footballers and boxers.
Lately, it's been difficult to talk about football without mentioning concussions. Why? Well, mounting concern over a disease called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, more commonly known as CTE. In the world of medicine, CTE is a relative newcomer. In football, we just learned about it 10 to 15 years ago. Here's what we can say. It's a progressive degenerative brain disease. It is like Alzheimer's. It can start with memory loss, mood swings, and difficulty in concentration, developing into progressive dementia, even possible thoughts of suicide. But unlike Alzheimer's, CTE can also result in significant aggression and lack of impulse control. The big difference, symptoms tend to begin much earlier in life, closer to your 40s instead of your 60s. In both diseases, there's no known cure. Researchers believe there's only one way to get CTE, and that is repeated hits to the head. What happens is that you get a buildup of an abnormal protein called tau in the brain. Scientists do know both the location of the tau and how much tau in the brain determines the symptoms you might exhibit. But scientists don't yet have a magic number of hits that results in CTE. It also isn't known who exactly would develop CTE. There are some players who take many hits and never develop symptoms. Factors like genetics and age of exposure to the trauma could play a role. How do you know if you have CTE? Just because you have symptoms doesn't mean you have the disease. In fact, as things stand now, you can only be diagnosed for sure after death. Scientists are researching how to diagnose in living people. A prominent group of researchers have found over 90% of former NFL players have developed CTE. But remember something important here. The number could be so high because of something known as selection bias. That means the brains that were studied were from people who worried that they had CTE. Also, it's not just football players that need to be concerned. Boxers, soccer players, people in the military, anyone who's exposed to constant head trauma can develop it too.
Since Assel's death, several studies have investigated the link with football, and growing scientific consensus exists that heading increases the risk of dementia, which is described as a loss of the ability to remember, think and take decisions, and affects around 55 million people worldwide. In 2020, a Lancet Commission report listed traumatic brain injury or TBI and other injuries from contact sports as risk factors for dementia. The decision to add CTE was steered by a watershed study commissioned by the Football Association in 2019 and was carried out by a research team at the University of Glasgow. The study compared public health records of 7,600 ex-professional male football players, most having played between 1950s and the 1980s. These footballers were compared to 23,000 people from the same general population who were the same sex, age and socio-demographic profile. Unsurprisingly, this study found that football was beneficial to health. Footballers lived more than 3 years longer than non-footballers and were less likely to die of heart disease. But they were 3.5 times more likely to die of dementia. Interestingly, the position that these footballers played also seemed to be correlated with the risk of developing dementia. Defenders who head the ball the most were 5 times more likely to develop dementia compared to the general population. For strikers, this was 2.9 times more likely, and for goalkeepers, there was very little difference for the general population, as goalkeepers are less likely to head the ball during games and training. However, just because there's a correlation doesn't necessarily mean there's a causal link. The lifestyle of footballers during this time was lavish, and those from predominantly working class backgrounds were abusing alcohol and smoking, which might also play a role in the development of dementia. And as such, researchers are now trying to untangle exactly how heading the ball could be leading to increased risks of dementia in later life, and they are using the exact same approaches that we've been covering over the last few weeks to do so. Indeed, neuroimaging studies appear to suggest that the impact of repetitive heading on the brain may result in structural and functional changes, and that these changes can be demonstrated in both former and active football players. For example, in a study by Igna Corti and colleagues, magnetic resonance imaging was used to ask whether repetitive impacts can result in long-term changes to brain structure, and whether these structural changes were associated with cognitive decline. In this study, researchers compared 15 former male professional football players to 15 age-matched controls, using high-resolution imaging and a series of cognitive tests. The researchers observed that the professional football players displayed increased cortical thinning with increasing age, compared to controls in the right parietal, temporal and occipital cortex. This increased cortical thinning was also related to reduced performance on a memory recall task, suggesting that football players' memory performance was significantly worse than age-matched controls. The researchers therefore concluded that cortical thinning and decreased cognitive performance was in line with the hypothesis that long-term repetitive heading might play a role in early cognitive decline among footballers. Despite the link between football heading and changes in cortical structure, a longitudinal study carried out by Stephen Kemp and colleagues among active footballers suggests that this association might not be reliable. In this study, 24 young elite professional footballers were recruited. This group was then compared to 17 control participants who took part in non-contact sports and were matched for age and gender. Medical examinations were carried out, as well as structural MRI scans and detailed neuropsychological assessments for both footballers and controls at baseline and during a 5-year follow-up. The results revealed that footballers scored on average 6 IQ points lower than controls. However, after a 5-year period, both groups demonstrated no significant change in cognitive functioning. Similarly, MRI scans did not reveal any significant abnormalities at either baseline period or the 5-year follow-up, suggesting that over a 5-year period, elite young professional footballers showed no significant changes to brain structure or deficits to cognitive functioning. However, the results of this study should be treated with caution because no accurate measure of heading frequency over this 5-year period was measured, and researchers did not record the position of footballers or whether they were actively playing in matches during this period. In addition to longitudinal studies, others instead have focused on the acute effects of football heading after a single practice session. In one study that did measure the effect of acute football heading, my friend Thomas Di Virgilio used transcranial magnetic stimulation to investigate the effect of a single exposure of repetitive head impacts in routine football heading. In this study, TMS was used to deliver a single pulse over the primary motor cortex to inhibit activity during leg contractions. The amount of time it took to recover from this inhibition was used to detect changes in brain function. In addition, both long-term and working memory were also assessed. Tom essentially measured the motor TMS effect on working and long-term memory performance at the beginning of the study among 23 healthy amateur footballers. He then had his participants stand in a gym in front of a machine and fired footballs at people's heads at various different speeds. Tom observed that after a single bout of 20 football headers, participants' motor control took longer to recover after the TMS pulse, and that their working and long-term memory performance was also worse compared to baseline. The results were novel in that they were one of the first studies to show that a single session of football heading was sufficient to result in changes to brain function and cognitive performance. However, it should be noted that no controls were included, and participants' brain function and cognitive performance actually normalised after 24 hours. So while intriguing, the data provides very little insight into the long-term consequences of football heading.
If I came in here and looked at the graph, I would say it looked pretty similar. But there is a difference, as in it is a little bit slower, the second one, than it is the first one. If you come to think of it, then heading a football at 20 or 25 miles per hour, 20 balls like I did in quick succession, then you would think it has to do something.
The arrow afterwards is slightly to the right. It takes longer to return to normal. And in an hour or two's time, we'd expect that to go back to normal. We don't know, because no research has been done, what happens when you head the ball 50 times.
Yeah.
Or you do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day.
Right.
So the cumulative effects, we don't know how they add up.
Right.
And the suspicion is that if you start looking at that, you might find more evidence for changes in brain health as a function of heading the ball.
In fact, several meta-analyses of long-term consequences of heading reveals a literature that is both mixed and limited. When heading frequency has been measured accurately, most studies fail to detect a significant correlation between head impacts and neurocognitive test performance. As such, evidence from neuroimaging and neuropsychological data suggests that the concerns in the media that football participation, and specifically the act of heading the ball, should be treated with caution. The reality is, though, that there are so few robust and well-designed studies looking at the long-term impact of neuropsychological health of former footballers or on the lasting consequences of football heading. So, while the evidence doesn't really demand real changes at the moment in professional football, neither can it provide football with a clean bill of health. Instead, findings from large cohort studies such as Field suggest a pressing need for appropriately designed and well-powered research studies to address the causal factors that result in increased dementia risk among footballers and, importantly, developing possible ways to try and reduce this risk in current and former players.